logo of somebody crying in the background. Just mute that audio, it will be really good. So basically, this is our 4th seminar series in partnership with the Office of the DVC from the University of Nairobi, together with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, OSIA, and Oxfam. So as your host and moderator today, my name is Leila Latif. I am a Nairobi-based lawyer and a fellow at the University of Nairobi. And like you, I'm also annoyed, affected, and concerned by the COVID-19 disruptions. So today's seminar will discuss fiscal and social protection policies during this pandemic. There are a number of developments and measures that have been put in place both at the domestic and international level on how to mitigate COVID-19 socioeconomic disruptions and to also buffer economies and cater for the welfare of the vulnerable people. As of yesterday, we know that the UN is contemplating to set up an autonomous body that will oversee the debt suspension as economies struggle to get back on track. The IMF and the World Bank have released conditional funding for struggling economies. Governments have worked out their bailout plans. But to what extent the informal sector, for example, will benefit from these plans remains to be seen. Social protection responses also largely fall within these fiscal responses that we are seeing at the international and domestic levels. So how have governments introduced or adapted social protection programs in response to COVID-19? Keeping all this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I now want to pass the mic. Please mute your mic. Thanks. I now want to pass the mic to our expert speakers to carry out this discussion forward. I will now invite Dr. Anne Kamau to start us off. Dr. Kamau is a medical sociologist. She has extensive research experience in inquiring into the social protection policies and the informal sector. She's also focused on research around labor issues and socio-cultural dimensions of health. So Dr. Kamau, over to you. Dr. Kamau, if you could unmute your mic, we can't hear you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum. Like you've said, I have been involved in research on social protection and the informal economy as a member of the University of Nairobi Institute for Development Studies. And I'm going to share part of my experience and knowledge in this area. Now, the main question which I want to be able to answer is what social protection measures and policies should the Kenya government take for containment of COVID-19 in the informal economy, and how can these measures be sustained or maintained post-COVID-19? I hope I can be able to share this. Now, when we think about the COVID-19 situation, what we know is that we're increasingly seeing rising cases since the first case was announced in March 13th. And what we know is that the entire globe is affected, and across the world is that the informal economy has been the most greatly affected. And this is the situation also in Kenya. We are now at 3 cases, starting from 1 case. And we know that the informal economy is diverse in Kenya. And this is a question, therefore, that we need to ask: what is the role of the informal economy in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic? And do we really understand the informal economy and how the COVID-19 is impacting on the sector? In Kenya, we know that the sector is large and it's diverse. It includes the agriculture sector, the service sector, and trade, and also the manufacturing sector. We know that about 83% of the Kenyan workforce is the informal economy. And we also know that most of those in the informal economy are women. mainly occupying either the low-paying informal economy jobs. Statistics estimate between 70% to 90% of the informal economy workers are women, with many of them being wage workers, earning very small incomes of 1,000 maximum per day. Most of them, although we know that there are also informal economy workers that earn quite a lot of money and who could be moved almost to really not small scale, but more the medium enterprises. But however, we know that a larger majority of the informal economy workers are in the small enterprises. Now, what we know also is that the sector is exposed to a lot of social protection gaps and inadequacies. We also know that the sector suffers more when it comes to economic support, and we'll be also seeing this even in the current response to the COVID-19 stimulus support. So again, the questions that will allow me just to move a little bit off the screen. The question that we are asking then, what measures are the measures that have been undertaken by the government, so to speak, are really responsive to the COVID-19 situation? What we know is that the measures that have been recommended, the stay-at-home measures, for example, and we know that people in the formal sector have been able to have alternative work arrangements. Many of us now are working from home. But the question that we ask, is this an option for the informal sector workers? We also know that we have reduced or restricted travel to only limited to essential travel, and this has also been enhanced through the dusk to dawn curfew. We also know that we have enhanced hygienic measures that require sanitization, washing hands, and this is really important in managing the COVID-19 and preventing the spread of the virus. But we also know that this also spreads largely also to the public transport sector, and we are seeing the measures that have been taken by the government. We also know that the informal sector businesses, including markets, have been closed, but a few of them have remained afloat, especially the open markets and the informal markets. And again, this is a question that again we need to raise to ask then, how best do we protect workers in these markets? Also, workers in the public transport sector, how best do we protect them in order to ensure that we do not they're not necessarily suffering more from the risk of the virus getting spread within the sector. Now, in terms of what we see as implications for the sector, what we know is that there has been increased vulnerability among the informal economy workers who has said that they're about at least 83% of our economy in terms of job losses. We know that there have been reduced number of people being employed. Some of them have been laid off. We have seen reduced incomes, mainly also attributed to the curfew and the fact that informal sector workers have to work fewer number of hours. For some people in the formal economy, you can work even until midnight, but for the informal economy workers, those who have to operate only when the day is open between 5 a.m. and 7 p.m. Therefore, it means that they have to close early and they have to close before 7 p.m. in order to be home by the time the curfew begins. So the main concern is a daily subsistence. And this is a concern that needs to be addressed from a social protection mechanism in terms of cushioning the informal sector workers. And these are the options that we need to explore broadly in terms of from a social protection perspective. We know that the government of Kenya has responded and it has provided economic stimulus and also their social protection mechanisms to protect the vulnerable populations, the ones that are going to be getting 2,000 monthly. But however, we know that the impact this economic stimulus program is unlikely to actually have real impact on the informal economy workers, partly because they are also not captured properly in the government systems. So in terms of even supporting them, it may be a challenge for the government in terms of reaching out to them. I would want to just read from a quote from one of the forums that I am in. And this is from the Kenya Transport Research Network, where I am a member. And I would like to quote one of the public transport workers who says that the public transport workers have been hit hard by COVID-19. Many units, that's the matatus or the PSVs, have been grounded. Those still on the road are not even making half of the targets set by the vehicle owners. Some have become moving stops, just getting in and out of petrol stations to fuel to complete a trip. So this tells you the real impact that even the ones that are operating, the vehicles that are on the road operating, many of them are really not meeting the daily targets, and many of them work on targets. So it's a real hit both to the workers and also to the owners of these vehicles, who also depend on these vehicles for their livelihood. So the question then that we ask is, what social protection measures can be taken? Can social protection really cushion informal sector workers in the informal economy? Is there evidence that the workers who are already enrolled in formal social protection mechanisms are covered in the context of COVID-19? Is there protection from shocks emerging from the health epidemics, even within the existing social protection programs? These are the questions that we need to ask. When you look at the data from the research that we've been doing, what we know generally is that there's very low coverage of informal sector workers in formal social protection programs. In a current study, which we are doing in Nairobi and Kisumu on social protection and the informal economy, jointly with the Roskilde University in Denmark and Mzumbe University in Tanzania, what we found that only about 35% of informal sector workers, that is in the transport sector, which we are covering, the trade sector, and the construction sector, are in formal social protection schemes. So that means the majority, 65%, are not included. In a similar study which we've done with the Retirement Benefits Authority, we found that only about 5% of informal sector workers in the agricultural sector, again trade sector, and the coastal region also are informal, are in pension programs, meaning that many of them are excluded or are not in formal social protection programs. Another study we did jointly with the Site Enterprise Promotion and Oxfam, we found that only about 26% of women in the urban informal settlements who are informal sector workers are enrolled in social protection programs, and only about 5% are in pension programs. So many of those who are enrolled are largely in health insurance programs, accounting for about 26%, and the rest, about 7%, are in pension programs and other in social protection, informal social protection mechanisms. So what we know is that most of the informal sector workers depend on themselves in the informal social cushioning mechanisms, like through the informal groups, the chamas, for protection against shocks. Maybe if there's an event of a sickness or death, they largely depend on themselves. And this is a question that we need to really ask, how do we move forward from here, given the current situation? And can the Kenyan government really be able to continue functioning the way it is doing in the current situation and in the future? When you look at the informal sector, beyond the social protection, we also look at issues of the trading spaces. We find that most of them either are working in areas that are not formally regulated, they are working in areas that are not licensed, therefore are considered to be illegal. Also, the way they are alleged, some of them are very close, and we're even asking the question right now, what is the ability of these workers to even maintain social distancing or physical distancing, as it's now being referred, when we know that they normally are very close to each other? Can they really maintain physical distancing for themselves and their customers when they have very small trading spaces? Can they maintain health and hygiene when water, basic services like water, are not accessible at the places where informal sector workers are working? Moving forward, is it possible for the government to ensure that any area where informal sector workers are working, there are basic facilities like water and toilet facilities to actually enhance health and hygiene going forward? Because we don't know what will happen in the future. This is just an epidemic which nobody expected, but is likely we don't know what might happen in the future. Again, when you look at the public transport workers, the motorcycles, for example, how are they arranged? If you go to most of the hot spots where they stop, many of them usually are very close to one another. And also, or the same again, they also are not able to access water and sanitation services. Most of the places where they wait for customers, this facility is also not provided. The other question again that then we ask, when you look, for example, at the traffic requirements, even for the motorcyclist, for wearing a helmet, how are we ensuring that the passengers get protected when a helmet is used by another passenger and this motor rider has to take another passenger? What issues are we taking into consideration, assuming that then we have to make sure that also we protect the passengers? So when it comes to the public transport sector, we know that the operating hours are few, they have to maintain physical distancing. Are they cushioned for the losses? Of course, everybody is taking losses, but is there a way of cushioning these workers who do not have a regular pay, who have precarious working conditions because they have to lose, many of them have lost their work because vehicles have been grounded? How do we cushion these workers going forward so that we ensure that, again, they do not suffer the kind of suffering that we are seeing? And this is what is really making them to even remain afloat. They have to wake up and look for food for their families that are suffering. So again, this is a question that we need to ask when we think about the informal economy. So for me, coming close to conclusion, is that we really need to look at what are the key issues when it comes to informal economy. And for me, the key issues that we have to grapple with is first to understand that the informal and the formal systems are linked. As much as we're saying that the informal sector carries a big threat, first by virtue of the high numbers, but second, we know that they are also supporting the formal systems. Workers who have to go to work have to be fed, some of them by public transport means. When they come back home, they have to eat, they have to pass through the markets in order to buy food. So literally, in terms of understanding, we know that the informal economy is complementing the formal economy as much as they are the ones that have a greater risk. So we also know that by and large, and from what you've seen in research, is most informal economy workers are excluded from formal social protection programs and they depend on themselves. These informal social protection mechanisms, like chamas, what we call them in Kenya, are also threatened because now they're not able to earn enough income to contribute for their savings, to continue savings in their informal groups that would cushion them. So that means both the informal systems, mechanisms, are also threatened as well as their jobs. So, and this is the need that we need to look at. Again, we know that what now the government needs to consider seriously, in addition to the economic stimulus options, is also providing alternative income replacements for vulnerable informal sector workers. And I'm saying vulnerable here because not every informal sector worker is vulnerable. Some are really poor, and especially women. Some of them are single mothers that have to provide food for their children. I know one organization, the Phone Initiative, now is trying to marshal members in our network to even contribute just 2,000 to help some of these women to survive. So we are saying is really we need to have income replacement options for informal economy workers who really cannot make ends meet. Then at the same time, for the informal sector workers, it is important for them to think about balancing between survival needs and reducing the threat of COVID-19. We need to understand that as much as the informal economy is overstretched and is suffering, the longer the epidemic remains, the longer they will suffer. So it is important for everyone to take precautionary measures in whatever means possible to ensure that the spread of the virus is not spread. And to come towards the end, I would say that we need to really think about what really works for the informal sector and what is it that we can embrace for now and the future in terms of COVID-19 situation. And I would want to first begin my colleague, to quote my colleague, Professor Vin Michula, who says that the public transport sector, because she's a member of the transport network, she said that the public transport sector should be a major policy issue, especially during pandemics and crises. It is my hope that the Matatu operators are in discussion with the government on issues which go beyond curfew and schedules and time schedules. So what you're saying is that we need to engage with the government, the sector needs to engage with the government, they need to be part of decision making, they need to be included in policy. I don't know if that time is up. And so we need to really think which models work best for the informal economy, what really works. We have examples of NHIF and NSSF and the way that they work in the informal economy, but the question is, are those that are already enrolled cushioned? If they are not, do we need to do more than what NHIF is doing and other social protection mechanisms to cushion them? Again, what evidence exists that works best for informal economy workers? We have examples of pension programs, even micro pension programs that have been found to be preferred by informal economy workers. I will give an example of the Bow pension plan that has been there. We don't know how several workers prefer this option, but again, it's one that needs to be studied further and explored further in the current public social protection schemes. So by way of concluding, I would say that risk reduction measures that include social protection, labor issues, and provision of basic facilities for informal sector workers should be explored. Again, we also need to explore mechanisms to enhance informal sector coverage and enrollment in formal social protection schemes, but also to go beyond these schemes to also note that there may be potential pandemics that they also health threats that they experience on an everyday basis that we need to caution them against, especially the public transport workers. People are coming to the vehicles with TB, people are coming with all sorts of diseases, and it's only now that probably we need to really think hard about how these workers are protected on an everyday basis, even from these health challenges. Then it's a time that the government thought seriously whether we need to roll out a mandatory social protection scheme for all workers, both formal and informal, and how this would be funded, whether through taxation, how the informal sector workers would participate in this, in financing these mandatory social protection programs, if this is the way to go, and also to understand the limitations that make the informal sector workers not to enroll in the first place. They have fears about corruption, they have fears about ability to maintain their continuous contributions, they have fears that they may never benefit from their contributions. So these are real fears that they have that the governments need to engage with going forward to ensure that informal sector workers are included in social protection mechanisms in the immediate and in the future. So I will stop there, and I thank you for allowing me the time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamal. That was an excellent presentation. You've raised a number of pertinent questions, and I'll be happy to see how the audience are going to engage on some of these questions that you've raised. You said that the informal sector works based on targets, and COVID-19 disruptions have disengaged these workers, for example, from the transport sector from their targets. So how should the fiscal and social protection policy measures protect them? How best can we think of securing, gender dimensions to when considering social protection measures at policy level, for example, especially in sectors that you said were unregulated and unlicensed. So, ladies and gentlemen, audience, let's hear your opinions on this in the chat box. We will be able to get you to engage with the speakers after the end of all presentations. So I will now ask Mr. Anthony Githinji to take the discussion forward. Mr. Githinji, he's actually an economist and industrial relations officer at the Central Organization of Trade Unions in Kenya, commonly known as KOTU. He basically has over 20 years experience in research and training duties, industrial relations, and management skills. So Mr. Anthony Githinji, over to you. Perhaps if you turn off your mic. Switch on your mic, Mr. Githinji. Okay. I'm not sure if he... Mr. Githinji, can you hear me?
Hello, Laila. I suspect Mr. Githinji has some connection problems. Maybe you can move on to the next speaker, and then we'll get back to him. Yeah.
Brilliant. So, Mr. Bosiro Nyamori, are you online?
Hey, Laila. Yes, I am.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so as we wait for Mr. Githinji to come back online, we'll just start off with Mr. Bosire. Mr. Bosire is actually a senior lecturer and my colleague at the University of Nairobi. He is an advocate of the High Court with over 18 years practice experience. He's a partner at a Nairobi-based law firm as well as a tax law lecturer at the University of Nairobi. He has previously worked as a tax advisor with Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and his practice areas focus around commercial law and tax law. So he is also the vice chairperson of the Committee of Fiscal Studies and engages in a number of research with our partners. So, Mr. Bosire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leila, and greetings to everyone. Now, the issues we are discussing revolve around the formal economy, and I want to look at how the fiscal measures around COVID-19 are impacting and are likely to impact on the informal sector. Now, perhaps the starting point for me is when you read government documents, policy documents, such as the budget, and also read some research papers around, is that the informal sector does not contribute much to the taxes that are paid in the country. That by and large, the informal sector is not normally caught within what is called the tax bracket. So that's normally the starting point for budget documents, and even if you look at some of the tax laws that have been passed in the country to deal with the informal sector. So to bring the informal sector into the tax system, there have been some reform measures that have been introduced there. So one was the introduction of the presumptive tax. Of course, the other one was the introduction of the turnover tax. Now, since this crisis set in, the government has sought to reduce the burden that is arising from the imposition of the turnover tax by reducing the rate from 3% to 1%. 3% to 1%. But also remember, these measures, I'm not sure whether they have been legislated, because what we have is a bill, the Income Tax Amendment Bill for 2020, and I'm aware that the Committee on Budgets and Finance was meeting yesterday, and I've seen a report they released. But there were media reports that particular law has been passed, but I'm not able to confirm at this particular point in time. So you find that is really the step the government has been able to take that affects the informal sector businesses. However, there are also a raft, an array of other tax proposals that have been fronted that may also affect the informal sector, as well as some legal changes that have already taken place around this particular area. And I'll look at briefly a number of core tax laws that we use in the country. First one was on VAT, value-added tax. So there is a law. From 1st of April, the rate was reduced from 10% to 14% for the products that are sold in the country. But the question you may want to ask is, how much is 2% worth? People are already earning very little money from the informal sector. So it's a discussion that we can always be able to have. So that's a law that's already in place. But in terms of proposals, there are a raft of measures that have been proposed, and I think some don't necessarily advance the interests of people in the informal sector, considering that what we call VAT is extremely regressive. the burden falls higher on people who earn lower incomes. For instance, I was seeing they are proposing to change ordinary bread from a zero-rated good to one that is exempt. No, zero rating and exemption in the VAT Act has implications, because ordinarily when an item is zero rated, it tends to be cheaper than when it is exempt. Because when it's zero rated, then the traders are allowed to recover what is called the input VAT, the VAT they have paid on purchases of the inputs that go into preparing the products. However, when you have it exempt, because traders are not allowed to recoup the VAT they pay for the inputs, and what they do is they load the taxes onto the goods when they sell them to the consumers. So that is an issue we really need to consider. I saw that particular proposal. But aside from that, I've seen some other measures that are also interesting. For instance, there are some that are affecting agriculture. There are some that are affecting the health sector. For instance, I've seen mosquito nets under VAT are currently exempt, but there is a proposal to make them taxable at 14%. So they will certainly become expensive. And we are entering the rain season and the cold season, when incidences of malaria tend to spike in regions that are normally susceptible to that particular disease. So those are some of the measures that are coming out from VAT. So it's a mixed bag. It's really a mixed bag. Reduce the rate, but at the same time move around products in the exemption, zero rating, and standard rating settings, reducing some of those particular benefits. Of course, the other major reforms are in the Income Tax Act, because the government collects most taxes from the Income Tax Act. And the one that is really featured prominently is the exemption from income tax for individuals who are earning salary or income of less than 24,000 shillings. So less than 24,000 shillings, they will be exempt from payment of taxes, including individual taxes and as well as pay as you earn. However, we all know that people who earn around 24,000 shillings in the informal sector are far and few between. So it's highly unlikely that they are going to feel the impact of this reduction when it actually kicks in. Also remember, the highest or the marginal rate for taxation for income is 30%. So they are proposing to reduce it to 25%. And the rate of 30% on income the marginal rate has been kicking in at the figure of around 47,060 shillings. Now they're reducing it to 25, then it will start kicking in at the level of 57,000 shillings. But remember, people in the informal sector, as I've said, do not enjoy this kind of income. And in fact, if you look at some of the statistics that have been bandied about, I've read about them, people who earn a gross income of 100,000 shillings are said to be less than 200,000 shillings. So this is a major proposal, but it's likely to have a negligible, if not nil, effect on the informal sector. Now, in addition, some other measures that Dr. Kamau also brought up when she was also starting her presentation. So, for instance, you'll find the government is saying that is encouraging employers to allow people to work from home, to work remotely. when you allow people to work remotely, it has implications across many areas of the law, employment, tax, health, just to mention it. So when someone works from home, they'll spend money on internet, on airtime, name it. Of course, there's some informal sector should be able to find a system for allowing them to deduct these particular expenses they incur while working from home. So it's one of the issues that can be able to also to be considered for some of the people who may also work in the informal sector. But whether it is able to work or not would also be a different issue. The other issue that we also want to talk about for people who are vulnerable is area around charities and also donations. If you go to the Income Tax Act, it has a provision that if someone makes contributions to charities, they can get that as a deduction when it comes to computation of their income. However, there are conditions that are normally imposed. So one needs to have authorization from the Cabinet Secretary for the national treasury. But now I'm seeing many businesses and also individuals pooling efforts to assist in this particular regard. So the government perhaps should be able, not perhaps, actually they should be able to rethink how to be able to facilitate the contributions and charitable activities of the businesses and other individuals who are also assisting the less vulnerable members of the community. I also saw Dr. Kamas refer to this. I was watching on the news and the government was saying they have already transferred 10 billion shillings to people who are elderly and also vulnerable in the society, and this needs to be commended. This has to be commended. But we need to find out going forward whether they've been able to cover all the people who are actually vulnerable in the society. Now, to finish this off, what I'll also mention is the bill, which contains many of these particular proposals, is 97 pages long. It's extremely long. Trying to study with a view to understanding what the implications are for many other sectors and how possibly that can also be able to trickle to the vulnerable members of the society, many who work in the informal, many of them who work in the informal sector. So Leila, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Buzire. I especially liked your point where you said that, a majority of the tax measures that have been implemented by the government are not benefiting the informal sector. I'm inclined to agree with you. Then my next question to you would be, and you can think about this later, why then should philanthropy be used as a measure or a means to support the informal sector? I think the duty should be with the government. It rests with the government to create these fiscal measures to help the vulnerable economy, the informal sector. We shouldn't really go back to looking at philanthropy, donations, and charity. So this is just something that I thought about. I'd also ask Dr. Anne Kamau and Bosire, please, do look at the chat boxes. There are a number of questions that have been directed to yourself. We'll be asking you to respond. Mr. Anthony Githinji, are you with us now?
Leila?
Yes.
I think I've lost you a bit.
Okay, it's all right. Where did you lose me?
I think I didn't get your question or actual contribution.
Okay.
You mind?
No problem. I just said that I do agree with you that the fiscal or tax measures that have been rolled out by the government are not really benefiting the informal sector. I do agree with you on that. And then my concern was that in terms of supporting the informal sector, why is it that we always want to look towards philanthropy, charities and donations as a form of supporting the informal sector, while initially it should be the role of the government to come up with strong and robust measures to help these vulnerable economies. So just wanted your thoughts on that as we go into the discussion generally, not now. So do think about it. And I also ask that Dr. Ann and yourself look at the chat box. There are a number of questions that have been asked of you guys to respond. So we'll also ask you to now respond to them at a much later stage. But for now, I want to ask, is Mr. Gifinji with us? I don't think so. I don't see him in the chat box. So what we'll do, we'll just go straight to Dr. John Musingi. I see you're on. Dr. John Musingi, he is a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi. He lectures within the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. He's a specialist lecturer in environmental planning and management and a consultant in upstream and midstream oil and gas hydrocarbons. So his current research is on large dams and the impact on livelihoods and ecosystems. He also looks into green growth projects and sustainable development. So happy to hear from you, Dr. John Musingi. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Leila.
Yes. Okay, Council.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, clear.
Yeah. My approach, first of all, my approach is I've been one of the people who believe that we have approached this COVID 2019 the wrong way, because when you look at our people, especially the informal sector, really, it's not going to be solved by telling them to stay at home, telling them to not to be near each other, as Dr. Kamau has elaborated. My thinking was we needed, first of all, to not to panic, because I think we are panicked. First of all, as a geographer, we need to understand most of these diseases are, climatically, kind of determined. For example, where we have seen a lot of fatalities, for example, we have seen it in Italy, we have seen it in USA, we have seen it of course, in England is also coming, and Spain. We have to understand, first of all, what is the weather there is now winter. Now, flu is basically, if you look at some of because I've done also diseases, especially malaria and some of the way diseases, epidemiology of some of the diseases. Flu is basically a cold weather, disease, and it's more serious in this kind of weather. So essentially, we needed to understand that factor. Is this thing so serious that we need to lock our people and create more problems? Because now it's such a serious problem. Because when you look at some of the countries that are rich, they are compensating people, who are off work, people who are staying at home. At least they are being paid more to support their families. Here we are telling people, don't do this. We have even a curfew that, tells people to go home before 7, as if there is any relationship between darkness and the COVID. Now, so essentially, my view is really we needed to understand this virus much more before we implemented some of these measures. Now, for example, I've seen, for example, yesterday in some of the cities in America, people are saying surely, even they will rather go to work instead of what is happening now, because people are suffering more, and more so people in informal sectors. The hawkers, now when you are doing hawking, you need to be a person and explain your commodity. Now a person is telling you stop there, So really, what is more serious? Is it this, the misery we are creating, or is it the COVID, the corona issue? Now, and again, when you look at what our CS is telling us every day, telling us that today we have 7 people now new people are positive. So the other day we had 5 or whatever 11. To me, that is not the statistic that we need to focus on. The focus should be on death. How many people are dying? We have only 14 since we started. Is 14 really significant enough to create this kind of panic? 14 people, even before the COVID, even the people who are dying of accidents in our roads per month were more than that. So why is all this really? What is the background? I fail to understand this. And can COVID really be serious in a hot climate like ours? I doubt that myself, being a person who has also done weather issues, environment, climate. I doubt even COVID is that serious in this kind of weather, in our weather situation. And let me tell you that the so-called success the government is talking about, that is because people are taking measures. They are not serious. They're just doing it for the law. After that, they just go back to their maybe factory settings. So essentially, I happen to be to think that the Tanzania model, where you tell people just protect yourself, keep hygiene, wash your hands, put a mask, and do your business. I tend to believe that is much applicable in the tropical Africa situation than what we have adopted. And then even when we have put roadblocks, people are still crossing those roadblocks. They use border. You drop here, then you get a route bypass, go and pick another border and go. So by the end of the day, it's like government versus the people. Are people really accepting what the government is doing? So, Laila, I don't feel our approach was the right one. Even countries like Sweden, with so much money. Sweden, I remember the last time they had already like 1,000 people had died of COVID. But people said we prefer our freedom. We will take care of ourselves. We are not going to stay at home. We will work and go on. Americans are now going to follow that. I see it happening. But here we are more likely going to even perhaps extend the curfew hours and do even worse things when our people are suffering. There are people who have been suspended from work, but because the factories have closed, but they still come to work and sit outside, because they have nothing else to do. So that is my approach. I feel that, first of all, I feel the disease is not that serious enough to have made our government react the way it did. Because a disease that kills 3% of those who are infected is by all means a very mild disease. It not made us, and we have seen it. It kills less than 3% of those who are infected. Otherwise, we know a lot of these people are now recovering, those who are infected and going back. So what is all this tabid and the panic button, which has been pressed by the government? So I believe that's one. We reacted badly. The disease is not serious, and I believe that with due course it will be proved that in our weather, in our environment, in our climate, COVID, just like any other serious flu, it will not that mega death of people dying like we saw in Italy. I believe it will never happen here. So Laila, maybe unless I'm, I may need to stop there. I've explained my point, and I'm quite skeptical about the approach. I believe it's not really the right one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ari. I mean, it's very important that you raise these issues. What I gather from your message is that the local context is very important in how we seek to address COVID-19. Just the way Europe decides to approach their measures in a particular way, it's not necessary that African countries should also follow suit. But then again, this entire idea about we're trying to prevent an outbreak of a disease, we're trying to protect the health sector, because in as much as we have few deaths at this moment in Kenya, if we don't protect it now, and there is a huge storm at a later stage, our healthcare system will not manage to be able to react to it, right? So I think you raise an important issue, and we'll be opening up to debate on these issues about your approach and what Dr. Ann Kamal thinks and what Bosire thinks as well about what you're saying. And I also contribute coming from a health professional background in terms of the right to help you to address your view. So looking forward to that. Yes. So Mr. Anthony Kithinji, are you with us now? I don't think so.
Laila, I believe Mr. Kithinji is having problems with his connection, so we may have to go ahead without him. I would like to also just highlight to the audience to continue posting their messages in the chat. Laila, I have personally sent you the messages, so you will read out the messages to the speakers, the questions to the speakers, and then they will respond.
That's okay. I'll do that. But before we go into that, there are two wonderful ladies we want to now invite to give their opinion on the fiscal measures and social protection measures taken by the government. The first lady is called Yvonne Maina. She's a law student at the University of Nairobi and a fantastic researcher with the Committee of Fiscal Studies. We also have Clara Kitungulu, also a law student at the University of Nairobi, and again, a research assistant with the Committee of Fiscal Studies. So two lawyers. Do we have you on the floor? So we can start off with Yvonne and then Clara, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yvonne, as Laila has stated, and I just want to thank the panelists for their contributions on this. I have garnered a lot already, and I just want to agree with most of the things that the panelists have said, and probably set out a few questions on my end that I think that are not coming out very clearly and are pertinent to our discussion today. So first and foremost, looking at the fiscal measures, especially that have been set out by the government, that were reiterated by Professor Bosire, I'd agree with you, Prof, that the specific measures like the 100% tax relief that was given to income earners of up to 24,000 Kenya shillings will only present a challenge, because a majority of these people, probably their payee would be like 1,500 Kenya shillings. And looking at also the reduction of the limit of income tax to 25% from 30%, that means that people who are earning about 50,000 shillings only get to save 150 shilling Kenya shillings. Yeah, and also the other measures provided by the presidential address, like the voluntary salary reduction that the president brought out in his speech. If you do your calculations well, you would see that nearly 0.2% of the national wage bill of close to 400 billion is reflected in that amount collectively. And also looking at the monetary policy measures that were set out to ease borrowing at lower rates, you'd see that a majority of the businesses are closed as Professor Musili has stated, and therefore this measure stands not to help much, because why would a business be borrowing money right now and yet they are not functioning? And therefore my question would be to the panelists probably, then what are the actual measures that government should take? Are there long-term measures that should be looked at to benefit the citizens more? And also, I like the discussion on the informal sector, and my contribution on that would be that the government has made an effort in terms of introducing policy, and we can see that most of them look like they are more towards avoiding humanitarian crisis. However, is the informal sector really shielded from the whole the effects of the pandemic by the policy measures that have been set out? I'm seeing that our informal sector in Kenya covers for up to 80% of the workers in Kenya. So then this means that a majority of the population, if the answer to the question I've set out is no, then it means that a majority of the population then are not really gaining from the measures that have been set out. And then looking at the fact that most of the country is now on containment, and considering the go business that has happened due to the pandemic and its effects, then could we suggest that the government takes more effort in introducing right economic policies to revive the economy in a way? Yeah, and to an extent, I would agree with Professor Musili by stating that probably staying in our houses would not be the rightful measure to take as at now. But I would like to also, I'm not so certain what exactly should be the approach that will be most effective, but I'd want to suggest like 3 of measures that I think, in my opinion, would act as a better covering for Kenyans as at now. So firstly, would you, as a panelist, agree with me that, say, a budget reallocation towards a kitty to support individuals, for instance, like government considering to cut back on development projects and non-essential recurrent budget expenditure, would be helpful? And if you look at the 2019-2020 budget statement, the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury proposed allocating around 180 billion Kenya shillings for ongoing road construction projects, as well as rehabilitation, maintenance of roads. And if possible, if the government uses some of these funds and reallocates them to curb the immediate need, which is to contain the pandemic, would that be more beneficial? And then looking at also the proposition made by Professor Bosire on zero rating essential foodstuff, yeah? Because I'm thinking if we zero rated foodstuff such as maize, flour, or rice, or cooking oil, among others, then this might ease the burden on these goods, or especially those in the informal sector, because they'll be able to afford that specific, the most essential needs for this time, yeah. And also looking at another measure as exempting individuals from personal mortgage tax, or I don't know, rental taxes. Would you suggest that we go that way as Kenyans, aside from just saying that now we are proposing to the government that people go back to work? Would this be possible containment measures? Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Do we have Clara?
Yes, good morning.
Morning, Clara. I don't see your face very clearly.
Sorry.
Go on.
Can you hear me? Good morning. Insightful the discussion. I'd like to particularly add on what has been said about social protection policies. Kenya. And in my opinion, and containment measures and programs such as the cash transfers. However, we also feel that these measures are effective because for them to be effective, they need even more problems, such as police productive to the cause. We're also seeing quarantine being viewed as punitive rather than as a public health measure, and quarantine facilities not being held to a standard to ensure every protection. And even the cash transfers, which is a good measure, but I feel like there's no transparency, and so we don't know what criteria is being used. So I'd say that the way forward during this time is for the government to build on the existing social assistance programs to ensure that it reaches as many people as possible, instead of what is happening, like where they banned food distribution that isn't coordinated through the National Response Fund. Instead, they should be liaising with all these foundations to instead reach as many people as possible. They should also maybe work at the community level to ensure that there's inclusivity. And this can only be achieved if they work at that level, so that perhaps trusted persons are allowed to come up with lists of the people who are most in need of assistance. And government should also maybe learn from this to come up with a comprehensive social protection scheme, like what Dr. Kamau said, so that in the future we are well equipped to deal with such emergencies. And if all this is done, I feel that citizens will feel more protected and their needs will be catered for, and maybe then there will be a greater compliance of the public health measures, since the aim of social protection anyway is to reduce vulnerability and poverty. And during this pandemic, it has been made clear that we're only as safe as the most vulnerable among us. So it's even more important to ensure that all citizens are secure. After Dr. Rusingi's contribution, I'd also maybe agree that our measures are too drastic, and maybe we should think about that and make it more localized, such that as much as we have measures that are actually sustainable for us as Kenyans and actually cause a positive impact rather than causing more problems. Thank you. That is it from me.
Thank you very much, Yvonne and Clara. I guess now we're going to go back to our speakers and ask them some of these questions that our audience have been sending to them. So I start with Dr. Kamau. Dr. Kamau, there are a number of questions that have been addressed to you. I see Ivan happens to be quite an active individual in asking questions to all of you. So Ivan asked Dr. Kamau that how do you protect the transport sector that is target-based, and does the informal sector workers, rather, do they have access to personal protective equipment? What's your view on that?
No, the issue of protecting the public transport sector from targets is a debate that is long overdue. We know that the Ministry of Transport through NTSA and the traffic regulations require that public transport workers should have some form of formal employment. They should have work contracts so that they don't have to work on daily targets. They should have monthly income. And this is a debate that has been long overdue. And it's something that we need to think seriously whether this is the opportunity to really implement this. However, we also know that for the public transport sector and for the vehicle owners to effectively do this, they also need to be protected in some way. The issue, what we know is that some of the vehicle owners say they do not control the vehicles. They do not control what income comes from the vehicles, that it is more the workers that control the income that is eventually delivered to them. So the question would be, how do we work with both the public transport workers and the vehicle owners, together with the government, of course, to ensure that we move away from the target system? Because if we move away from the target system, we'll have solved a lot of challenges, including even issues of them having to compete to access passengers, we'll see a lot of difference in the sector, even in terms of regulating and organizing the sector. Now, with regard to, but however, that doesn't mean that at the moment, both the workers are not struggling. They're struggling to meet the data targets, but the workers, the owners too, are also not getting, perhaps also getting reduced income. Now, on the issue of the public PPE, what I would say is, for me, I would say the government has done a good job in terms of educating citizens and about the COVID-19, in terms of putting measures to protect the spread of the virus. However, left alone the public transport sector, it may not be enough to say that there is sufficient PPE. A lot more is needed in terms of really ensuring that public transport workers have and are using PPEs. The public transport sector, in terms of matatus, we can see there's a physical distancing that is being enhanced. We see there is a sanitization, or at least washing of hands. How effective this is something that we also need to really find out. But we see within the motorcycle sector that you'll find in some areas, maybe outside of the city, some people even being carried to people. Some don't even have the protective equipment, even masks. The masks, there's some they don't have. So the question is, whose responsibility is it? Is it the customer, in this case, the user of the public transport service, or just the owners and the riders and the operators themselves? So I think we all have a mutual responsibility as citizens to ensure that we're protected. But for me, the question would still be, how then do we ensure, because the motorcycle riders would only ideally have at most 2 masks maybe, how then do we ensure that anyone else who uses a motorcycle after this other passenger has used or has used it, then also is protected? I think this is a question that we need to ask going forward and to work best with the sector, because I believe that the sector also can offer solutions that we can work with if we engage them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anne. Thank you so much. I'll come back to you with other questions, but now I'll move to Mr. Bosire. Mr. Bosire, Christine Neumann asks you 2 questions. She asks, why is there a delay in announcing of tax measures and then their implementation? And the second question she asks is whether there is an emergency committee in Kenya comprised of both government and the private sector dealing with measures with regards to COVID-19. Your response? Mr. Bosire.
Sorry, Leila?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah. You can. Did you hear my question? Yes.
No, I got the question.
Good, okay.
I got the question.
Brilliant.
The question from Christian?
Yes.
Sorry, from Christine. Yeah.
Yes.
I was saying, by Kenyan standards, the legislative process is moving very fast. Because if you look at the bill, the Income Tax Law Amendment Bill 2020 was published on 30th of March. But we know the procedural requirements. For instance, there has to be public participation. This has been done. The Parliamentary Committee on Finance and National Planning has considered the bill, and I saw the report. The report, I think, was released yesterday. So in my view, it has moved fairly fast. With regard to the second question, there is a committee in place, several committees that are actually dealing with this particular crisis. And I've seen there is one that draws membership from the private sector. So there is a committee. But how it is working and what the effects of the work is an issue that we'll have to analyze going forward, because it is still a bit early to be able to see the impact of their work.
Thanks, Bosire.
Back to Leila.
Thank you, Bosire. So I'll come back to you again. For now, I want to move to Dr. Musingi. Dr. Musingi, you actually have Mr. CJ Mwangi, who agrees with you that the solutions for COVID seem to be more problematic than COVID-19. So you actually have somebody who supports you in that. Ivy asks, and I'll read out what she says. She says, John, I agree with you. Most people in the informal sector operate from hand to mouth. If they don't go to work, they don't have food on their table. Most are asking whether they will stay home hungry with their families. My question, and that's her question, do you think it's better for Kenya as a developing country to come up with its own solutions, keeping in mind our economy and that the majority of Kenyans don't have the savings to stay at home? And then Kefa asks that millions have been made in donations. And the question is, where is the accountability?
Thank you, Rela. Yes, I agree with you in totality that, we are creating more problems by telling people to stay at home. I have prepared the Tanzanian model, although we have seen the fingers are increasing. But again, as I said, getting infected should be the major issue. The major issue is really how many casualties are we getting? That should be worrying us. So far, the figures or statistics don't show that really the fatalities are not really so significant compared to, the problems we are creating. Our economy is really, dependent on informal sector. A lot of people are not, they work for themselves, things that cannot even be captured by the government. Even when they are talking about relieving them through pay as you earn, really, to me, that is not really going to be, to touch a lot of our people. So essentially, we are saying we needed to have our own approach and try to analyze this situation and see what works better for us. Is it what we are doing right now? Teaching people as they go home, from work. So, because the model we have taken, which is basically the Europe and, model, in my view, is the wrong one. Tanzania is doing well. Of course, we see the fingers have started rising. But really, how many people have died? There's still very few. I believe this disease is going to pass because, first of all, as I've said, because of the, our climatic, our uniqueness in the tropics, the tropical Africa has a unique, climate, which, I believe, even I've read an article where they are saying that even in Europe that they are keen for summer to come because they believe COVID will not survive in summer in Europe also. So I tend to think we are panicked. We have created more problems. We needed to sit down, evaluate all these issues, and see the best approach, as you said, country-specific approach to this COVID, problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I don't know whether I've answered you.
Well, yes. So I just
about whether the money that is being given. I think that is more that money many times never reaches so many of the needy people. It's very good for the books and for the PR that we are getting donations, but whether they are reaching or the needy people, that is another story. Look at, for example, the informal sectors, the so-called Kibera, Mukuru, Kwajenga, Kwaruben, and so on. Now we are talking about going to, mass testing of people. Now, what for? I want you to note that indeed the frontline, some of the frontline workers are the health workers who are most likely can easily even infect these people. And you can imagine now the problems they can create. So why do we have to go to test people who are not complaining? I don't understand, isn't it? Wait for the people who come. I'm sure if I'm very sick, I'll go somewhere to hospital. Then you can pick me there. But don't come to my place and then say you want to test me for COVID, isn't it? Is it the money they want to show that they have spent the money? They have spent the money they have been given testing people. I don't understand, Leila.
We'll take that up. We'll take that up. Thank you. So I want to go back to Dr. Kamau. Dr. Kamau, there's a question from Mr. Eshushi Richard. He says, what would cushioning informal sector income look like? What kind of measures can you propose for that? He says, I understand cushioning to be different from catering to informal sector survival needs. That would see measures such as free credit bundles or caps on essential food pricing. So his question is, what kind of measures would you be able to propose to cushion informal sector? And then Joan asks, what sort of funding options are available to help the informal sector? Dr. Ann.
Thank you again. Now, in terms of cushioning, it's true what he says, that cushioning is beyond just basic. I've seen another one saying that cushioning is beyond just giving food aid or food ratios. When you think about cushioning formal sector workers, we need to think about both short-term and long-term measures. Just like what John is saying, most of the informal sector workers are also living in the low, most of them are renting homes. Most of them, some of them are living in the low-income areas, the informal settlements. But like I said before, not all the informal sector workers are struggling. And I like the suggestion by EVIG using the community structures to actually be able to target who really needs in the immediate to really be provided for. People don't need to sleep hungry just simply because they cannot go to work. Therefore, they cannot eat, or they cannot stay at home because they have to go to work. So those are the only two options maybe at the moment which are available given the kind of response that we have. Now, we need to think about long-term cushioning measures for the informal sector. Now, but also at the same time, I would throw a challenge through the existing social protection systems that focus more on health cushioning, pensions programs, and maybe we also need to go beyond that. And surely when you think about social protection, we think beyond just the basics. We also include preventive measures, we include promotive measures, including just ensuring that people have basic social security and also workplace protection. But for me, the issue is, in terms of cushioning the informal sector workers, can we go beyond what we've been thinking about? Because all along, as we've been doing even research on social protection, we've been telling informal sector workers, why don't you get into social protection mechanisms, mainly the public ones, so that then you can be cushioned against health, a cushion against economic shocks. But what evidence is there to show that those even who are enrolled are really even benefiting now? I think there's really no evidence now. So we need to challenge the social protection mechanisms that we've been pushing for. And in some extent, I would agree with John, let's work from the baseline of Kenya. Let's say the 80% of our workers are in the informal economy. Can we use that as the baseline to inform the public health response? I am not saying that what is already recommended is not adequate, is not good enough. I think it's good enough in my view, but however, we need to go beyond that and plan not for the formally employed, but also plan for the majority who are the informal economy. If we get that right, in terms of how we work with them to cushion the sector, in the short term and the long term, in the long term, and I think then we'll really be saying that we are including them, as at the moment they are largely excluded, and there are many reasons that make them to be excluded from the sector, from their own side and from also the system side, and those are issues that need to be addressed going forward. But for those that really don't have food now, at the bare minimum, we need to be able to feed and to just not die because of COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Kamau. There's one more question from Brian, directed to you, Dr. Ann. He asks, do you have any data that shows how COVID-19 free contributions to the NHS among informal sector workers?
No, Brian, sorry, I don't have that kind of data. Sorry.
Somebody's mic is on. Could you please just mute it so we can hear Dr. Anne?
Yeah, Brian, we do not have any data currently to show, okay, from my end, I do not have any such data to show how COVID-19 has affected voluntary contributions to NHIF. And I think, to me, this is a really important issue to raise and to even find out and to investigate. But from what we know, any shocks that affect the informal sector results in either non-payment of premiums or even just people dropping off. So when I think about retention, and I hope that in addition to what the government is saying is that there will be people will be cushioned to some extent from government system, we need to include even social protection mechanisms so that workers who are not able to pay their contributions do not feel like they will be penalized for this, because we know that NHIF, NSSF, they have mechanisms that when you don't pay your premiums, then after some time you don't, especially for NHIF, you don't benefit from your premiums. And I think this is an important question that has been raised, that we need to be able to also cushion the informal sector workers who cannot raise the premiums now, who cannot pay their contributions now, from not accessing benefits when they have to, when during this time of COVID and post immediate COVID-19 situation. And I think, to me, that will be my response. Perhaps we need to check with NHI whether there's any data, whether they're monitoring this. I'm not sure, but we are likely to see a reduction in payment of contributions to the national schemes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ari. So now, Basira, back to you. Ivan is back again, and he's asking whether there are any accountability measures that have been put in place to ensure that donations and imports of grains, for example, for food aid are not diverted to privately held companies. He's basically discussing the corruption elements in countries. So what's your response to that? And then we also have Brian and Ivy who asked the same question. They say the question regards cash transfers, and they say, does the government of Kenya have a database on vulnerable populations to whom they're supposed to make these cash transfers?
Now, with regard to the accountability mechanisms, I don't know of new ones, because the government is working the same way it has been working in the past. And with accountability mechanisms in the government, the Parliament, Auditor General, parliamentary committees. So my guess is that these are the same accountability mechanisms we are going to have in place. Whether we need one to deal with the specific crisis is not an issue I'm sure about. We already have those mechanisms in place. They may have challenges, but they should be able to, hopefully, be able to work. With regard to cash transfers, I think I would request you to pass this question to Dr. Kamau, because she's the one who deals with this particular sector from listening to a presentation. But I'm not aware of. I would think there is data, but I've never seen the data, because it's not an area followed up keenly. Perhaps you pass the question to Dr. Kamau. She could assist us.
Dr. Kamau, would you want to respond to that? Thank you, Basir.
Yeah, sure. I think the government has a database of vulnerable populations, like through the cash transfer programs. Those have been benefit from the cash transfer programs. And this, the NHIF has a big database of the beneficiaries and the contributors. The NSS has a big database, but also more important, the Social Protection Unit or the Social Protection Secretariat. They have a database, and now they're moving towards having a single registry where they can share the data amongst themselves. So the obviously orphans and vulnerable children, the ones who are benefiting from the the Cash Plus program, that is the 70 and above, the ones that are from the dry areas, also the ones who are getting the food safety net and the food safety net program also are part of this. So this data is available within the government. However, what we know when it comes to informal economy is that we may not really have captured properly the real vulnerable populations within the informal economy. And the sharing of this data is important going forward within government and even to identify more vulnerabilities across the sectors. But even more, for me, the question I would throw is then how are we using the Huduma number data that we collected recently? Is this a database that can also inform the government in terms of even identifying further vulnerabilities and who really needs to be supported? Because I think this is a very rich database that the government can use to inform its social protection programs and even doing better targeting if we really have to go towards targeting or whether universal social protection programs. I think this is, for me, an immediate point where the government needs to start working from. Let's get the Huduma number, whatever you corrected, that data that you corrected then, let it inform government policy and planning going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Musingi, now back to you. 3 questions. I'm going to start off with Catherine Toure. She says, how many deaths would there have been if the containment measures were not put in place? So she's basically challenging you to go forward on your previous argument that, we've reacted very harshly, we've reacted without thought on how to deal with COVID-19. So she says, had we not put in place these measures that we have had, what would be the number of deaths in that scenario? And then Victoria Loch, she says she's not convinced with the argument on climate, that because it's going to be summer, the virus may not really affect as many people. She cites the example of Ecuador, and she says Ecuador is in the tropics and it is also badly hit by COVID-19. What's your response to these 2 ladies?
Well, about the 3% cannot be significant in even in statistics. So even those who test any hypothesis, really, that is what. Just look at the fatalities of the infected people. It's 0. What it's so small. So basically, although one could say every life is it's significant, but surely if you look at the other pandemics that have occurred in history, really they were really serious. If for example look at like Ebola for example was killing 70% of those infected, and the way it ravaged parts of West Africa. It was killing 70% of those infected. This one is killing 3% or less. So essentially, statistically and in terms of whether it is not significant, it's just quite small. And being infected should be the major issue. The issue is, are you recovering? And we see the recoveries are quite, overwhelming. They are almost 3/4. Over 3/4 of people, not even 3/4. It's a big percentage. So I still sticking to my point that, fatalities for this disease, it's quite too low to match the drastic measures we did. I'm saying that if you compare what the cons, the pros and the cons of this, then I'm sure you get my argument that we could easily have done better than what we have done now. About the climate thing, yeah, I've seen, for example, the Ecuador, although I've not seen the detailed statistics, and Ecuador is also in the tropics. But again, since I don't have the detailed statistics, I may not, about the Ecuador situation, I may not really go I may not really answer that question very well. But I have a feeling that because I've read a scientific article that is saying also they expect the COVID to disappear even in Europe when summer comes. I've seen that because obviously the virus may not survive particular temperatures. And as we know that this virus is flu-based. The flu-based, as I said earlier, are more, fatal. When, by the way, even the ordinary cold kills people in Europe.
More, exactly.
Here, it doesn't. So I'll stop there, Leila.
Okay, so basically, your background on sustainable development kindly, I believe,
Yes,
informs your point of view. And I do
yes.
understand the disruptions caused by COVID have also
Yes.
resulted in the SDGs themselves being, stalled. And then we're also seeing that we heard yesterday that oil was trading at, negative $32.
Exactly. The oil sector has actually collapsed. The oil sector has actually totally collapsed.
So basically, when you're looking at the economic effects on the economy, and you're looking at the economic effect, and you're saying that it's not commensurate with the kind of responses that we are
Exactly.
because it's really affecting the economy at a larger scale, so that even the oil prices have dropped. And then post the pandemic, how are we going to try and restructure or recover our economic welfare for the country and also the social protection measures of the people? What does that do to sustainable development?
It will take a lot of time. If I may add also, the tourism sector has also collapsed. I saw the other day they were showing in a hotel, which was used to be full of people. It's now the monkeys that are taking a swim. So basically, now it will take a lot of time to go back to where we are. Although I will still stick again, maybe with the summer coming, maybe this disease will also disappear in Europe. And now, if it disappears in Europe, of course, now we'll start getting the planes coming back. And then maybe from there, the oil sector will start, kicking again. And of course, with transport, the oil sector, the oil sector will be back into its feet. But it will take a bit of time because really there are a lot of uncertainties whether we are going to go back to where we are. There are people saying really normal may not be very near soon, although we are saying we think it is a month or so, but it could take long, especially in sectors like tourism, the oil sector. Because now people look at most of the countries, for example, in the Middle East, that survive on oil only. Now you can look; they are really looking at a very bleak future because without transport, all the planes are packed. Very few vehicles are moving. Now, what are they going to do? So really serious, but we may not have really an obvious answer to to the future, to the very near future.
So a very capitalistic argument there, Dr. Ari. I want to ask you, so the response that we're seeing in African countries, especially Kenya, with respect to mitigating COVID-19 crisis, is this because we've not really had a pandemic emergency plan in the country? So when this happened, we really didn't know what to do, and we're just borrowing practices from other countries. And are you not advancing a fairly heavily rigid capitalistic point of view, which says protect the economy at all costs, and it wouldn't matter what the healthcare sector is like? Because basically saying, in as much as we're responding quickly, we're responding unfairly to the health crisis, but we're trying to look at it from a broader future perspective. That in the event you have more deaths coming up, you never know about the future, right? How is the health sector going to now create this buffer to prevent more deaths, to secure people's livelihoods? How does it protect the rights of health itself? So how do you balance these two arguments?
There are no more deaths coming, Leila. You can take that to the bank because even when you look at the 14 who have died, many of them had other health issues. Maybe perhaps I'm HIV positive, maybe I'm diabetic, maybe or what. So I don't see many other deaths coming, really. So I will stick to that. But then again, you know, people, there are also some laws of nature. Survival of the fittest. Some good genes will go. Will remain. Others will go, and life continues. I would rather be happy for a shorter while than living in misery, locked down. We must look at all these things. Of course, Kenya did not have any model of how to cope with this, and what they were looking is just the pictures from northern Italy, and then they panicked. Yeah, this is coming. And the bad thing is, most of the policymakers are people, the politicians. Normally they know that when I'm sick, I'll get a plane and go for treatment, perhaps in India or maybe in London, UK or Johannesburg. Now they know they can't go. They must also protect themselves from, they know that we have to be together here. And therefore, I think that is one of the causes of the panic. Because really, this thing isn't that critical to take these drastic measures. This is my view. It isn't. It isn't really. We should tell people to go to work, keep their hygiene, wash their hands, and move on.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Musingi. So I want to go back to Dr. Kamau. Your two more questions. The first question is, should the public and the media also have a role to play in driving social protection measures for the informal sector? And then Lucy has another question. She says that, trying to understand her question here, the measures that we're now putting in place should not really be short-term measures, but they should be long-term measures, not just to cushion the informal economy during the pandemic, but also have a broader environmental impact to protect, for example, floods and mudslides. What's your view on these?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that different actors need to come together to respond to the pandemic. And I do believe that already many of them have already done so. We've seen even globally, there's global response, people even reaching out to countries in sub-Saharan Africa to just understand how is the global response to the COVID-19 going on. We do believe, and I know that development partners are also moving debates on how best do we cushion the informal sector from the COVID-19, and even in terms of organizing the sector. The questions that have not seen coming on the table is how do we in the future cushion the sector going forward? And I like also there's a question that I've seen there about how do we even cushion the rural economies from getting affected by the COVID-19, considering that a lot of people now are those that, for example, in Kenya are able to move their families to the rural areas, especially for the sake of the children. So it means that we really need a national response, not just a public response to the informal sector cushioning. For me, it is one thing to say that is 80%, but 80% of what? There are people in the informal economy who can take care of themselves very well. And I think we need to be able to segment these populations, either using the national data sets. I know we may not be able to cover everybody within the national data sets. We have the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics that does surveys regularly. Recently we had our national census. But in terms of how we're able to use these data sets to inform how we plan and how we move on with the public engagement in terms of social protection is important. But key to that is that we need to educate the public on the importance of social protection. I think awareness, we say, is high, even in the formal economy, but understanding that the informal economy can be part of social protection, there's a big gap. And this is a gap that we need to fill through education and awareness creation, and even designing programs that work best for them, because not all programs that are rolled out by the national scale can work best for the informal economy. So we need to really be able to respond to this. I'm not the best. I think Dr. Bosire perhaps can respond to the one on the environmental concerns. This is not, but not to say, I think it's an area that we need to focus on, but I'd rather leave that to Dr. Bosire. Perhaps he might be able to respond better than I can on that question.
Thank you so much. So, Mr. Bosire, your response?
Leila, I think, is it Dr. Msingi better placed to respond to the environmental issue?
Okay,
so Dr. Msingi.
Yeah, I'll come to Dr. Msingi.
What was the question?
Yes.
What was the question on?
Yes.
What was the question on the?
Indeed. So
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can. The question was asked by Lucy, and she says that the measures that we're looking at currently in response to COVID should not necessarily be short-term measures. We should look at them as long-term projections. In the event we have issues like floods and mudslides, these measures should also, take effect during these times and not just for COVID. What's your response to her view?
I don't understand what the question is all about. You're saying the measure should be long term, for example, like what?
Yeah, so should
because you see, COVID is a disaster. Mudslides and the landslides is also, those are also a disaster, but of course at a local level. And the approach to mitigating each one of these is totally different. So I don't see how we need to connect these because environmental disasters are more localized, while this COVID is now a kind of a national and international problem. Yeah.
So different approaches to be taken.
Yes.
Okay.
Different approaches from yes.
Okay. Dr. there's another question from Kristen Neumann to you, and I'll read out what she says. She says, I think your point is well taken. To what extent are the measures taken really necessary and also effective? So again, a repetition of what you've been saying. Perhaps one could have reacted differently, she says. To what extent is there an exchange here that is also based on facts? There is also a discussion in many developed countries as to what extent the measures taken were really necessary or part of an overreaction due to a lack of actual knowledge about the virus. Can one possibly reason for implementing certain measures be that they were taken with a view to negotiating possible support from international organizations? Quite an interesting comparison. Yes.
I think we need to. I get our point. The thing is, there was kind of panic when World Health Organization declared this pandemic, a global pandemic, and so I mean, we may need to. You've seen, for example, America, President Bush, not Trump, trying to punish World Health Organization because of the way they reacted to this. I believe that is where the blame is placed. They did not give any kind, they just declared a pandemic. And once they declare that, each country reacted in their own way. I believe the World Health Organization should have done this thing better, so that at least they can try to, give a kind of prescription for, for example, the developed versus the developing countries. But when they declared, it was like now a stampede, each country trying to show they are serious about it. And many of these countries, like the poor African countries, many of them also wanted to show that they are doing something, and therefore they need help, even because they perhaps many of the, due to some of the underlying economic problems they have, perhaps they also saw another way of killing you know, killing what? Two birds with one stone, isn't it? You solve this problem of health, but also you get money, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm trying to say the World Health Organization really did not do, it could have done better, in my view. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Anne. Dr. Anne, there's a question from Al. I don't know if it's a he or she. The question is that most SMEs and firms will definitely collapse, and after the pandemic, people will naturally move to rural areas to cope with joblessness and high living costs in urban areas. The person says, since we already have unsustainable food farming, the concern would be how best should we cushion rural areas from the oncoming property crime surges, because some people will definitely turn to crimes to make a living. Also, the person asks, how should we deal with pressure on rural primary schools once parents move from towns to rural areas?
That's quite a loaded question, and it's true. The pattern that we are seeing and has started is that there is a possibility that people will move to the rural areas. In a positive way, I think there's more appreciation for the rural areas, perhaps unlike before. But it also doesn't mean that rural areas are necessarily that poor. We know that the poverty in the rural areas is because they don't have access to markets for their goods. If you go to a Singishu, there's a lot of maize, but the question is, are these farmers getting really good returns from their produce? If you go to areas where they grow tea, coffee, the question is, how fast do we improve the rural economies and ensure that they get good returns for the investment, because they put in a lot of money, they put in a lot of labor, but perhaps it's what they get in return that is not consummate, does not consummate to the intake that they give. So I think first the Minister of Agriculture should have a clear policy response to COVID-19 in terms of the upsurge. We might find more people actually moving more to engage with in the agriculture, to participate in the agricultural sector. We might find more people doing farming in the agricultural sector moving forward if they move to the rural areas. But again, then are we going to see the same challenges that are witnessed in the agricultural sector in the rural areas going, as people move there? But there's also a big number that remain in the urban areas. They will remain maybe urban poor. For them, it's just a means of survival. Again, what do we do with this? I think is that all the ministries, whether it is a Minister of Trade, the Department of Trade, the Agriculture Ministry, they all need to have a response strategy to COVID-19. They should anticipate there will be changes and things will change in their sector. There might be more participation in the agriculture sector, which is to be a little bit secure now, although we know the international markets also affected. But again, even in terms of cushioning the agricultural sector, we need to cushion the farmers.
Yeah.
They are equally affected, not just now, but even previously. Farmers were crying due to lack of government support. And the government needs to take the sector very seriously and to invest more and to ensure that farmers get return for their work in the agricultural sector.
Thank you.
So I hope
Absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Anne. Yes, thank you. So now back to Mr. Bosire. 2 questions for you, and then back to Dr. Musingi again. So, Bosire, you initially said that tax measures that we currently have are not really benefiting the informal sector. And then I asked the question that in that event, a lot of governments, the informal sector themselves, they're actually looking for support from the philanthropists. So why is philanthropy being deemed a suitable alternative to help cushion the informal sector? Shouldn't that role just rest with the government itself? Then there's a question from Evelyn, and she says, is it too drastic a measure to allow for the deferral of turnover tax payment for a few more months? Mr. Bosire.
With regard to philanthropy, remember what we are learning, I think in the law of trust, what philanthropy deals with. One is alleviation of poverty, suffering. And many societies, including developed countries, now philanthropy is entrenched. So they provide some sort of social support system to some sectors of the society. So we need to look at philanthropy from that particular perspective, because there is no way the government is able to do everything, deal with the crises that arise. So we need to look at it from that, so that the question then becomes in supporting what is being done on the philanthropic front. What is it that can be done from a legal perspective and even policy perspective to encourage and be able to promote that? Then two, with regard to, I think what Evelyn may be talking about is perhaps suspending or repealing the laws that allow imposition of turnover tax and also presumptive tax. I think she was talking of turnover tax.
Yes.
My thinking is it may be a nice idea to suspend the tax for some time, because then that one leaves some money for those who are working in the informal sector. That is my thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, before we wrap up our session, Dr. Musingi, back to you. You must have seen a lot of discussion on the chat box between Ivy, Joan, Ture, Christine, and the rest, basically agreeing and disagreeing with you and calling you out to tell us what is your theory that informs your thinking. But I'm not going to ask you about that. What I'd ask you rather is that if you are in a position to come up with a fiscal or social protection policy measure during this pandemic, how would you respond to it? What would you do different than what the government is doing?
That's a simple question. But I wanted to comment first of all on the green economy, because you have talked about it. Green economy basically is creating jobs in the rural areas, and people going to rural areas may not necessarily be very bad, especially if they are not getting employed in the cities because of the closure of factories. So perhaps if they go to the rural areas, maybe they can promote green economy. That means relying more on nature. But of course, there is a caveat in that, because to rely on nature, you need to also have markets. You need, for example, to sell, to depend on, to sell your ecosystem services. That means, for example, if your production is based on nature, you need to have a market for that. And many of these markets basically come from tourism. And now that we see tourism is basically at its knees, on its knees. So I wanted to say that that going to rural areas could promote green economy. But again, there is a problem that, again, even the green economy requires a market, and so now we know the market is not, and tourism is one of the major markets for green economy. Now, coming back to my model that government could have, I still buy the Tanzanian model that people work, keep the hygiene, social distances, wash your hands, sanitize, and so on, and then work. That is my model. I believe Magufuli got it right.
Thank you.
When we meet it. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much. I want to extend my compliments to all speakers, Dr. Ann Kamau, Mr. Bosira Nyamori, and Dr. Musingi as well. Thank you for taking your time and spending the entire 2 hours with us discussing this critical issue about fiscal and social policy protection measures. For the rest of the audience, thank you so much for joining us, for being very supportive, with good comments, asking questions, and engaging with us. I'll only say in our parting remarks right now that you can join us every Thursday for a continuation of these series. If you have any topics that you want to address, you can always write an email to us and we will be happy to oblige. We have taken note of some of you saying that it would have been great to have a person from government as well on panel. We will see what we can do. We make no promises, but we'll try our best. And if there are no other questions, then I'd be happy to close the session today and wish you all a very, very good day. Stay safe. And like Dr. Musingi says, wash your hands and sanitize.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Class imeisha.